Hey everybody, welcome to My GM Academia, the show where we talk about learning to be a dungeon master one step at a time. My name is Paul Garza. I play Ryuji in High School DnD. Today's topic is going to be prepping for and running the all-important Session 0. And I have here with me Tyler Windle and Robert Nesby, two members of the High School DnD team. Welcome, guys. Tell us about yourselves.
Yeah, so as he said, I play Kai in High School D&D. That's what you guys might know me as. But as far as my dungeon mastering experience, I mean, I do run a couple games. We have this one I might have referenced in some other videos called the Thursday Night Group, which has been going on for, I want to say, almost a decade now. Has it been that long?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. But and we do a lot of D&D, but I think I've spent more time in Travelers, but I do of course love D&D, and I do love putting my own twist on things too. So I definitely love just kind of diving into the books. I can't tell you, my bookshelves behind me, I think I have 2 shelves dedicated just to RPG books. So
Well, yeah, guys, and I'm going to keep this short and simple. As Paul said, I am Rob, the GM of High School D&D, and thanks for coming by and listening. Paul's got something really cool planned out for us, and we're going to go over some things.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's great about this is that you guys have a lot of Dungeon Master experience. Now, I've done my own DMing in my life. I used to DM a game of Pathfinder for an 8-person party, actually. That was something. Pathfinder, a first edition Pathfinder, I should clarify, back when it was sort of the enthusiast's alternative to Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition.
That's got to be the hardest thing to do. I can't imagine running a Pathfinder game.
Absolutely. It was it was a harrowing experience, to say the least, but at this point in my life, also sort of inspired by the campaigns that we've done together. I'm DMing a group now and having a lot of fun, and we'll talk about that. But I wanted to hear a bit about the DM experiences you have had. Tyler, you mentioned a bit about what you've done, but you did fail to mention a pretty fun game we ran once with a couple of musicians from...
Oh, yeah, back in the day. It was actually, believe it or not, my first game I ran either ever or outside of like a full game I ran outside of like the Thursday night group that I'll be referencing a whole bunch.
Really interesting.
And so, yeah, I'd made a lot of mistakes, but I learned a whole ton. But I actually had a blast because, you know, this was my first experience playing with Paul, and he built the most just wonderful character, and
as it seems like Paul does frequently.
Yeah, I would describe it as next level, but you know, he always seems to outdo himself. I mean, I think I can only think of one other player that I play with consistently that I can give that award to. And sorry, Rob, but it's your buddy Charles that we added into the group with his barbarian and his other barbarian, and sorry, but yeah, I've done. I think that was my first D&D group, and it was just wacky. We had, you know, a paladin, a wizard, and everything you'd expect a monk. We had a lot of first-time players and some experienced players, but everyone was pretty new, including myself, I would say, because I had just come off a 3.5.
Oh, yeah, and definitely we want to talk to the first-time and new-time players, because for a first-time player, you're almost always coming in as a player. But coming in as a DM can also be something that your group needs. If you have a group of first-time players, somebody has to be the dungeon master, and I think that's what we're going to talk about a bit today. But Rob, I want to hear about your DM history, and I know it's quite extensive.
Well, I mean, it goes all the way back to freshman year of high school, so it's pretty extensive. So what's that, like 16, 17 years now?
You're going to age yourself.
Well,
we don't say numbers here. We be vague about it.
No, I am not ashamed of my age, but so I started out. I was a player for a game we actually had 2 halfling rogues. Me and our friend Ethan were both halfling rogues, and we basically like Merry and Pippined our way through that campaign. And that campaign was a like single day campaign. It was supposed to go longer than that, but
oh no, it's much worse. I heard the story.
Yeah, no, I don't think I have to go into detail on that, but it was kind of one of those. I guess there was a lot of players that did not know what a role-playing game really was, and instead we were just like, let's all fuck with the DM. So yeah, that was not very pleasant. But anyways, so that DM obviously decided I don't want to DM anymore, and we still wanted to play D&D. So I said, okay, I'll start running games. And that kind of turned into everyone being like, hey, Rob, we want you to run games. Hey, Rob. And for a while there, of course, I was that guy who was like, well, I want to play. But there's always that little voice in the back of my head that said, you're not experiencing the game the way you enjoy it when you play. You prefer to run the games. So, I mean, so I had to get good at running games, and because that's what I enjoy doing. Is I enjoy being a dungeon master, and I'm so surprised when people are just like, I hate doing it. But
I actually hope we get to bring that up again, because I've actually noticed that, especially like, I've been in charge of the SIO Twitter account, and there seems to be a big divide between dungeon masters and players sometimes, and it's very interesting because you guys are we're all playing the same game, and I love both aspects of it, but at the same time, you wake up some days and you're just all like, nah, I want to run the game. And some people wake up and they say, I never want to run the game. And maybe they enjoy DMing and they jump in the position when they want to, but I don't know. Like, it's kind of those situations. I think most DMs start being forced into the role.
Right.
Absolutely. And that's what I want to talk about. So what happens when you want to first get into being a dungeon master? Well, that's how we're talking about Session 0 today. And for those of you that don't know, a Session 0 is essentially the first session that a new group has where they talk about character creation, they plan what's going to go on for essentially the remainder of the campaign, and the dungeon master will meet with the group and help them make their characters, help them establish things, all kinds of things. But it's the first meeting people have. And it can be a really daunting task for dungeon masters, both new and experienced. My first Session 0 was just as intimidating as my most recent Session 0. And I want to start out by talking about what do you all think a Session 0 should be? What needs to happen at a Session 0? And do you have a checklist that you make for it, or et cetera? Let's hear about what you have to say about that, Tyler.
Well, okay, so I can guarantee you that Rob and I have some similarities, but we're mostly very different. But I think some of the things we might be same on is I do like to account for the members in the group. So when I'm running, I haven't run Adventurers League, but I have stepped in to like DM an emergency party once before, and I didn't know anyone. And that threw me out of my element. And so it kind of gave me a different perspective, but I do like to have balanced parties, and I try to encourage it from the start. So when I first meet with everyone, I'm saying, okay, let's all discuss what we want to do, and if we find out that people are kind of doubling up, let's talk about ways we can, I guess, steer away from that. Still let you do what you want to do, but if you're playing on a party with 5 rogues, someone's going to get upset about it, and and that almost never happens. But I mean, the last game I played in with the most experienced gamers that I've ever been, a group that I've ever been in, I think we had 2 people double up on tank, and then one guy got fed up and switched off of tank, and then the new guy came in and played tank. And I'm sitting here the whole time like, I said this so early on. I do think it's super important to make sure that you're just very clear with the party from the beginning. Some DMs, myself included, have gone as far as to like write out their expectations. And
like what kind of expectations? Like what classes you want them to play? Rob, do you have any expectations like that, or?
Well, Rob's read mine.
I mean, that's almost entirely of what So I like to actually do multiple quote unquote session zeros.
Okay.
I mostly have, I basically have a moment where I pull all my players together and I say, this is the theme I want to do with the campaign. This is my expectations of the players. And usually I lay it out. I may not go to them and be like, I'm being hard about these rules, but mostly, just my number one intention is always that I want the entire group to have fun. And that's myself and all the players. So I like to allow an open dialogue, and I make that the expectation. I will allow an open dialogue for people to express how they feel the game is going or how each other are dealing with each other. And that's mostly my first part of a session zero, but I guess we'll get deeper into like what I do for past that. But setting expectations is always number one, and you have to make sure you communicate them early and often.
Yeah, and actually I got to plug that Rob is really good about this. I think it's because he has that manager background. I am not so good about it, which is why I do the opposite. I think that the main difference you might notice between his and my style, and I don't know about you, Paul, but he says he likes to have multiple session zeros. I want to have like one big session zero that everyone's in so we can all communicate in person. I've pretty much always run it that way. It doesn't always work. I think one of the most fun Traveler games I had with Rob in it, he actually missed session zero and didn't come in till like the third session. And it worked out perfectly fine. But that was like, that was kind of like me judging things because I had a session zero maybe a month before that on a failed game that I was just kind of like, okay, these are the rules. This is what we're doing. And I think I tried to railroad them a little too hard. And now my expectations are like, okay, I'm only using these books. If we have a problem with a player like drinking too much, we'll give you like a warning. We'll give a talk to you. Things like that should come naturally as an adult. And those are kind of like the expectations I set out. It's a little less about D&D and a little more about being a group.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few things there. You touched on class and party makeup, what books you're going to use, table dynamics are something that I think might be really important to go over in a session zero. I know in all my session zeros, one of the things that I make sure to let them know is that the number one rule is we're not hindering anybody else's fun, right? I think that's maybe a wholesome way of looking at it, but I think that's an important rule to talk about, table dynamics, etc. But I wanted to go back to something you said about having one session zero versus multiple session zeros. I know for myself, I tell my players to show up to session zero with a character and a background already made. And I want them to tell me ahead of time, of course, what class they're thinking, because, like you said, we don't want 5 rogues. We already have way too many rogues among us.
Yeah, even like 5 fighters. It's just all like, it's just going to be a flex.
Wow, I guess I'll have to leave then.
Oh, yeah, and ironically enough, we played a game where our DM tried to force us to all be the same class, and everyone abandoned that instantly. No one listened to
Tyler,
the DM.
I think you and me are going to be bringing that campaign up a couple of times.
Yeah, there's a few things I want to talk about it, and no shame to the guy. Like, he did a fantastic job.
It was his first campaign, so we're not going to name names or anything, but there's a lot we can take away from that campaign.
Yeah, and it ended amazingly. So mad props to that. Like, he duct taped that crashing ship together, and we rode it to victory. So
well, I did want to get back to something pretty important though, and that's books. So I know when I was even new to D&D 5e, and I've been around RPGs for a while. I've been around D&D 3.5, Pathfinder. Even if you see my student profile, I talk about playing the EverQuest RPG, which is something I bet most of you can't relate with. But
dude, I've never even played EverQuest.
Hey,
you'd be surprised. We're reaching a pretty niche audience here, so
yeah, I'm willing to bet a fair amount of our listeners have played at least a bit of EverQuest. At the very least, played something inspired by it. But I got scared even of 5e seeing that there's 6 or 7 different books that might be necessary. And I mean, talk about 3.5. If you suggest someone play 3.5, I mean, what books do you even begin to start with? So I wanted to talk about what some of y'all's favorite books are for being a dungeon master, because even though it seems like the dungeon master just needs the dungeon master guide, we all know that's not the case. So what books do you guys prefer, and what do you make your players have, and what do you make sure to have on hand? Let's hear what Rob has to say.
Well, I'll tell you this. I think you actually don't even need a dungeon master's guide to run a campaign. The only book you really have to have is the player's handbook. That's number one. You have to have a player's handbook. If you don't have a player's handbook, you have no basis of the rules. 5e, the entire rule set is in the player's handbook. It's not in the dungeon master's guide. In fact, the dungeon master's guide is simply just a collection of tools to help you expand on your world building and expand on your role sets and whatever else you want to do, especially on the third pillar when it comes to like exploration and whatnot, which, you know, I still feel is the weakest pillar of D&D 5e. I think it was better in 3.5, but we're not going to get into that discussion maybe for another time. Yeah, exactly.
Next episode.
But you only need the player's handbook. Obviously, like having a monster manual will be fine, but there's so many resources online to pick out monsters. Like you got Cobalt Fight Club, you have Don John, you have so many resources to help you find monsters and build encounters. So, you know, player's handbook first and foremost, and then from there you can kind of expand and explore. But as far as campaign building, the Dungeon Master's Guide, I really love the campaign events page, which is on page 27. That gives you like a whole bunch of like world shaking events. So it gives you like some really cool things like rebellious uprisings, cataclysmic events, stuff like that. So, you know, just to kind of plug that in there for anyone who may be interested, but it starts on page 27.
Yeah, the Dungeon Master Guide is actually super cool. It has a bunch of things in there that I would describe as very useful, very helpful. It definitely facilitates the gameplay. However, I will kind of agree. It's not super necessary. It is nice because it's one of the few places that you can find magic items, and they give you tables to roll on for everything. So I always hope that someone in the party has the Dungeon Master's Guide, at least for reference, and that's usually the case for most groups. Even if you're playing like an Adventures League or something, you know, just go up to the store and like just borrow one or something. But okay, so the book I'm going to say that is absolutely 100% necessary, and this is going to shock everyone hopefully, is Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Chapter 2. The Dungeon Master's Tool. I think this is in like disputable, like one of the coolest things that they've added to the game. They talk about sleep, falling, swimming, sleeping in armor, going without long rest, cooking. Like they go into more details about like examples of skill checks and how to use them. They talk about like whenever there's like a cone, like how to draw it out on a grid, how to do circles on a grid or triangles, like spells on a grid. So if you're playing on a grid or if you're playing on Roll20, that's an invaluable asset. In fact, I've had to use it almost in every game. So I find myself actually sorting Xanathar's Guide to Everything almost like exclusively when I build a game. In fact, they have tables for like if you want your party of X number of players at X level to fight one monster, this is the CR you need to pick for. And then they have other tables that say if you want to fight, you have a party of this type of people, how many minions should they be put up against? For example, in the game I ran last week, I sourced this table. So on one, I had, I think I had 4 characters at level 16, and it says challenge rating 19. But I knew my characters were a little broken because I'm very, very generous with magic items. So I bumped it up to 21. They had an easy day with it. And then when I wrote another one, which we didn't use, but I went to that next page, and just so you know, it's page 89 and 90. And I went, okay, 16th level, if they're going to fight, say, a CR 10 enemy, there needs to be a ratio of 2 to 1. So I believe it specifies, 2 players per 1 enemy. And for example, if they're fighting a challenge rating 2, 1 player to 5 enemies, and it just really like it makes building your encounters super easy. They also have random event tables. I think it's way more valuable than the Dungeons Master's Guide. I will say I didn't know this until I bought the book, but I probably haven't touched the book other than that chart at the very beginning of the Dungeon Master's Guide when they talk about experience points threshold. And that's why I say someone needs to have the book, because I can't find that online. I look all over the place and I can't find it. So, at least if you know someone who has the book, take a picture of that page, because that's a useful table.
Which that table he's talking about is on page 82 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and which Xanathar's Guide to Everything is literally just an expansion of both the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Yeah,
absolutely. I bought it as a player because I wanted an excuse to find some different subclasses for the sorcerer that I'm playing.
Oh yeah.
I bought it a while ago, but I was looking to a sorcerer, and I like the shadow magic sorcerer. But I find I use it way more as a DM. Because the common magic items actually is something that I was begging for in the original Dungeon Master Guide, and that I've had to use, homebrew supplements before in the past to find those kind of things.
Yeah,
and this book adds a lot of great common magic items. There's a table for them on 136, and also the Downtime Revisited, talking about downtime activities, really adds a lot of potential for roleplay during long rests, which I think is a place where we in our campaigns classically like to add a lot of content into our long rests, which may be a little atypical, but we've done that a lot.
Actually, I need to say something on that scary word you said, homebrew.
Oh.
I know a lot of dungeon masters avoid that like the plague. But if you have a copy, if you're going, okay, like for my setting, I need to homebrew some things. I need to have a lot of things that aren't in the Dungeon Master's Guide or the Monster Manual. Well, actually, they exist in the Dungeon Master Guide. So I'm running a Nier Automata style game. It is set in the future. There are robots. It's all done on D&D 5e. Well, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, they say this is how you build an enemy that's not in the Monster Manual. And just flat out. And it's just like, bam, you can skin it to look like whatever you want. And here are the stats that would go with it. And they do that actually with weapons. There's rifles, there's revolvers, there's laser pistols. Yep. You can do that with armor and other stuff. And there's artifacts. You can make artifacts. You can make sentient weapons. So if you're thinking like, I need to homebrew my game, instead of going on to some untested, third party, not to subtly reference that other game we were talking about, but instead of finding some random PDF online that's just like, oh yeah, this will work, you can actually use the Dungeon Master's Guide and it will lead you exactly where you want to go.
Yeah. So that's really useful. But you mentioned monsters, and I have to get to this. There's 3 main books I think that are out there that kind of act as monster manuals, and those are, of course, the Monster Manual, Volo's Guide, and of course, Mordenkanon's Tome of Foes. Rob, I know you mentioned Mordenkanon's a lot. Do you feel that a new DM should have access to these books or have these books, or should they stick to the main Monster Manual?
That's kind of a tough question, because they essentially all do the same thing. They give you information on monsters. They give you expanded lists on monsters. But ultimately, it really depends on just what you're trying to do. Now, the question is, and this is mostly because the topic here is session 0, right? So are you allowing monster races? Because if you're allowing monster races, then by all means, you need Volo's Guide or Mordecai and Tome of Foe. Because if you don't have it, you're going to be homebrewing, and which is fine, but you literally have these stat blocks to help you build a kobold. You have to build a goblin, to build a lizard folk or lizard man. You have all sorts of various like monster races in there. And then there's more that obviously Wizards of the Coast is always releasing. And, I think, was it Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is coming
soon.
out. Yeah. So, and that's going to be a whole nother expansion. So, the cool thing is, like, I'm really glad that Wizards of the Coast is expanding on 5e. So, but, just for the sake of talking about session 0, then it just depends. Do you want monster races, or are you just trying to be simple? And if you're trying to be simple, that's okay. No big deal. But you probably only need Monster Manual 1 for that.
Yeah.
I'd say if you're new, you probably just want to get the basic stuff. You want a good understanding of the rules, and save it for your next game when you're going to go crazy and allow the war forged robot army and your Cobalt team running up against dragons. Because there's a lot of roleplay aspects that you wouldn't even imagine that go in there that are built into the lore that would definitely change how you play and definitely change how you run the game. And so, if you're new, probably want to stick with the basic stuff. I think I'll second that. Yeah.
And I'll also go with that too, because the Monster Manual, I think you're, no matter how many supplemental books I buy that have monsters in them, I stick with goblins and kobolds for the first few. Call me old fashioned. Call me old fashioned. My parties always fight kobolds and goblins the first few.
Guards. Yeah, it's got all the good stuff.
I think with High School D&D, I've been using nothing but aberration so far.
Yeah. And, I will say though, I was happy to have Mordenkainen's on Roll20 because one of our players is playing a tiefling. And the tiefling sub-races available in Mordenkainen's actually add a whole lot to that race. Honestly, the player's handbook doesn't really do much for it.
Oh, yeah. Actually,
tieflings,
same with
elves.
Yeah, same with the elf race that Kai took.
And the drow, one of my players put in his background that he had a major drow enemy, and I had to have somewhere to get some drow lore from. And Mordenkainen's came in handy there.
I gotta say, it hasn't come up yet, but I guess to let you guys know, because of that elf subclass, I was looking for an elf subclass race that provided a dex bonus, so I didn't have to play my 160th wood elf ranger. and I think it came from Mordecai's Tome, where I got it's like the Night Queen elf, and it has a dex bonus. Thank goodness.
Shada Kar or something.
Yeah,
Shadar Khan.
Yeah. So I have the dex bonus, and you get some really cool feats. You actually get like a teleport skill, some immunity, and it actually really fits with our Shadow Sorcerer. It really fits with our Hexblade Warlock. And we were originally going to have a Shadow Monk, but now we have a Drunken Monk. But it still fits with that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And let's rein this in just a bit, going back to focusing on session 0. I have two more things that I think new dungeon masters out there are asking. And of course, the first one is, do you need a world map for the first session? I mean, location is everything for a lot of role play. I mean, inevitably, your players have to start somewhere. Maybe they're in a tavern, but that tavern's in a city. So do you guys build a world map for your first session?
I'm going to use that as a soundbite. Paul saying location and then triplicate it. Location, location, location. I think Rob and I have some very strong opinions on this. Playing a game that didn't have a world map that caused some pretty serious issues.
It may or may not be the same campaign we were referencing earlier.
It may or may not be the same one, yeah. Okay, so I have two perspectives on this. When I have a DM game, I always have a map. I draw a bunch of BS on it, and I update it as we go, as they explore it. And Rob can contest, on my Thursday night group, I drew a bunch of random stuff on a random map, and when they explore it, then they unlock that part of the map, aka it gives me a chance to write the map as they explore it, rather than have a whole map for them that they just they're just being railroaded to me. So it gives me a little more freedom. So yes, I say you have to have a map. However, when I play a traveler's game or a sci-fi game where it's a bunch of ship jumps to random planets and stuff like that, I mean, I have like maybe a galaxy map with like territories on it, and that's about as far as I go.
Okay.
So just a very loose, like kind of pointless map. I will say I spend a lot of time on my map building before session 0, because even if I don't know what everything is. Even if I don't name everything, I got to have places and locations for them to want to go to and be curious about. Even if I'm making up the name on the spot, but I want to give them this quest and they have to go to this place and find this thing, and they go, where's this place? I spit out a name, and then I open up the map and there's a dot there, and I'm like, oh yes, that's where it is. And then I write the name in right there, and they go, oh yes, he always had that planned. No, absolutely. But they don't need to know that.
And I've seen your hand-drawn maps. I know you hand-draw a lot of your maps, and I've seen some of the maps you made in computers and such. But Rob, I know you, I've seen some of your maps. They look fantastic. I know you use some software online and such.
Yeah, I mostly use Incarnate. Yeah. It's a nice tool, but I always have a world map going into session 0. And you want to know the craziest thing? I thought that making a world map, it's quote unquote world, it was just for the city of Osaka, but I thought that was going to be easy because it's like, I have a city now. I just like, hey, let me just look up a couple of districts and throw it. That was the most daunting map I've ever made. Because it's like, I had to actually go and do research about each of those districts and about the city of Osaka, Japan. And like, it was fantastic. I learned a lot, but when you're doing a first time campaign and you're going into a session 0, here's something that I really like to do. And, this is kind of for those new DMs. If you're really just like, I don't know where to start with this, let your players decide. Like, have a map, maybe have a couple cities that you want to do, but then be like, hey, you're playing a Dragonborn. Where are the Dragonborn from? What's their city like? What's their home like? Take that information and apply it to your maps.
Yeah, and I think the reason I asked this is because actually the map you made for High School D&D, that very map you're talking about, was totally instrumental in my character design and my character background. So I think that though some people think a whole world map or even just a district or region map, I like to have region maps for my players.
Yeah.
Have them meet cartographers along the way and they fill out the region map.
Yeah.
Meet someone as a world map, I think is a great way to get into the story. I like to think of the player's handbook as library resources in the game, and they meet cartographers, etc., like I mentioned. But I think it's critical for players to know where their players are going to come from to make backgrounds, and they can relate their characters to each other. They can say they know each other. They come from the same place. It can be really good to have that.
It definitely depends on your situation. In my other group, I gave them, in the world building process, I said, okay, everyone comes from these towers, and there's 6 of them, or however many of them, I think 8. And I let them name the ones that they came from if they wanted to come from different ones. And after some of them were named, other people were just like, I come from that one too. So, they kind of tagged on it. And I said, tell me a little about it, or I'd base it off of how they just built their character. However, you can come in with a map that is like completely blank and tell them to build it out, or you can come in with something that's already there. But in my opinion, when you're world building, you need a world to build off of, so you need something. It just, something has to be there. And I'm actually curious if Rob was talking about the same game as me, because we played a game without a map. And I just remember we're asking constantly, we didn't know if we were heading east or west. Like when we did these, he's like, you're going to this town. We're like, okay, cool. Which direction is that? He's like, that way. And we're like, okay. And we would get lost on a survival check, and we're like, okay, well, how do I find my way back? I was like, well, you're heading the right direction. We're like, which direction is that? I need to know. Are we going to the coast? Are we going to the center of the country? Like, I don't know. And it was actually kind of stressful for me. In my game, I don't make a big deal about it, but I have these comm towers, and whenever they defeat or beat the enemy at the comm tower, it unlocks the map, and that's how I've been doing it. And then the things I put in the map are like the quests that they've done and like important locations, so it makes them feel like they're kind of heroes. It's like, oh, all this stuff on the map, well, it's only on the map because you guys are so awesome. I try not to make a big deal about it, so I don't know if you've even noticed that, Rob, but that's kind of been my philosophy.
Yeah, and that works too. And honestly, really, it's just dependent on what your goals are. because I also have known great campaigns where it literally starts like, you guys have known each other your entire life. Y'all have all lived in the same village this whole time, and this happens. We actually had an idea for a really cool campaign. It was going to be a sequel campaign to a previous one, where it was like, you're like these kids from this village, and it gets attacked by our former characters. And now the former characters are the villains, and they just like wipe the floor with the town. And it's like, now the whole point of the campaign is get revenge on your old characters.
Oh man. And you just touched on a lot of things. You touched on world building, lore, what lore exists in the world, the big bad evil guy. And we're going to take a bit to talk about that, but we're going to take a quick break here, and we're going to come back in just a few minutes to talk about some of our personal experiences with world building and things we've done in our own session zeros that are a bit more we'll have to wait and find out. All right, we'll be back in just a minute. Okay, and we're back. And you know, during the break, I thought about what we were saying about the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I felt a little bad. So I decided to flip through it a bit, and I realized actually there are some things I use in here. And as a first-time DM, I found it really fun to flip through the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I actually it made me think of something. So one of the things I definitely use from the book as far as lore goes is the planes and like the astral plane, planar travel. So I wanted to talk about what stops a lot of people from running a campaign, the most daunting task, world building. And that means so much. It means, what's the story going to be? What kind of setting is this? Who's the big bad evil guy, right? Who's that? Who's the villain? How do you decide on that? So I want to hear your perspectives on that. How much do you do before session zero? How much is necessary? And how much do you let your characters influence? What do you guys got? Rob, why don't you go first on that?
Well, this is a shocker. I mean, anyone who knows me probably knows my players almost entirely influence my world building. I almost go into my session zero with like almost no lore written. And what I really like to do is I like to, and this goes to my multiple session zeros, but like a lot of times I will take my players' backgrounds and their backstories, and I'll develop lore based on that. I'll develop villains based on that. And sometimes I'll have a big bad evil guy already in plan. For our Lost Souls campaign, I had no clue. I mean, that's not exactly true, like, because I had Korik, but that was more of I knew Tyler as the player hated that character, so I was like, this is an emotional driving factor right here, so I know Tyler's gonna love this. So, but as far as Geralt goes, I had no clue. I actually had multiple options on that, because I had options for like if Torvik or, so I had like all these NPCs lined up, and even the possibility of a player end up becoming the big bad evil guy. But, it's mostly a what does your theme call for? So that was a like dark fantasy style campaign. So I wanted to keep the door open for big bad evil guys, even though I did have like that one central character that I knew at least Tyler was going to push the party forward. That was more of a MacGuffin than it was my big bad evil guy.
I think that shocked our DM as well.
Absolutely. And I remember that. I remember being shocked. He was our friend the entire time, and I definitely didn't expect that one.
So when I plan my BBEGs, it's very, very different. And part of it goes off of because I play with a very niche party. We know these guys so well, like we all know each other. So it's a lot easier in that aspect. And it's also a lot harder because of that. because you know that there's some hooks that they won't bite, and there are some hooks that they will bite, and then that there are some hooks that they will bite, but they won't bite just because they want to piss you off.
It's a beer and pretzels party. It's like pretty much a beer and pretzels party.
Not always, but yeah, sometimes. And so I come in, I build the world, and I write the most like 2D bad guys ever, and they don't have any issues with that. I'm like, he's evil. Why? Because he's evil. And maybe occasionally in the game I'll be like, he nuked a city. Bam, there you go. He kills lots of people. Like, why is he bad? Because the plot says he's bad, and they're okay with that. They're like, oh, let's go hunt down this evil. Occasionally I've actually, for like mini bosses and for like ending arc bosses and bad guys, I have used the Dungeon Master's Guide to randomly roll an enemy, and actually ended up being really cool, a very flavorful enemy. One enemy that stole one of our players' organs because they were trying to. Well, I can't spoil this because Rob's in the game, so he'll find out. Yeah, so it was really funny. I rolled that up, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is hilarious and perfect.
They're trying to what, Tyler? They're trying to
Don't
what?
worry about it. But I also at the same time, in tandem, I let the players write the enemies too. So the enemy is so flat that the players project onto it the third dimension. So like I when I came in, I was like there's bad guys, and that was pretty much as flat where I left it. And then Rob comes in, he's like, well, there's this evil terrorist group called Omnicide Mechanicus, and I'm like writing this down. I'm like, oh yeah, that's good. Okay, yeah, that's what they are. Yeah, I remember that now. And then he's just he's pushing everyone that way, and I'm like, okay, let's just nudge the party, and I can build that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say in my campaign I'm running right now, I think we're on session 17 or 18. And I just decided who the big bad evil guy was. I've been hinting at it. I've been saying there's someone out there doing something real bad, and they want to end the world, etc. And I told them what the villains are doing, etc. But it wasn't until this last session I even told them who it actually was. So, and something I wanted to say, the monster manual actually gives a lot of good resources for, like we said, mini bosses. Yeah. Because, and I'm looking at the Beholder right now specifically.
No.
A lot of
close that page.
That is not a mini boss.
Well, yeah, you're exactly absolutely
I'm looking
right.
at the Mind Flare right now in the Tarrasque, and
okay, maybe a CR13 is not quite a mini boss, but a lot of monsters in the monster manual will have regional effects. Mm-hmm. Something that will affect something within a mile or more, and they exert their regional effects over a town or city, and I find that's actually a great way to introduce mini bosses.
Paul, I know exactly where you're going with that Beholder. I love the fact they can dream shit up into existence.
Yes, absolutely.
I will say though, I have never used ever in my life have used a pre-built monster for any of my bosses or bad guys. I don't like. I feel like there needs to be a creative aspect. Even right after I said my characters are super flat, they also need to have that room to grow. And I don't like having someone or a book like for reference for that, because I don't like feeling locked up in the position whenever I'm building an enemy. So, and like I said, it really depends on the game and the players. There's a lot of that goes into it. I mean, we played a Mech Travelers campaign, and I told them, I was like, this is going to be influenced by mech animes. All right. And one of the players had watched one of my favorite animes, and he was getting really obsessed with it, Gurren Lagann. And I was like, okay, cool. So
was that me?
No, it wasn't you. So we had basically the Spiral King was the big bad guy, right? And and in the show, he is a one-note enemy. He's evil. Why?
Yeah.
Because he's evil. That's not the point of the game. And I don't think every game needs to have the villain be the point or the purpose of the plot.
and I agree with that actually. And maybe this is a little bit existential. Maybe all the evil in the world is the big bad evil guy, and it's pointed onto a single. It's focused on a single point. That's kind of how I see it. We have a generic good versus evil in the world, and then evil is this person is that evil.
Yeah.
Well, some of the best advice I ever got for a big bad evil guy was, I think this actually came from Taking 20, and it was your big bad evil guy should be actionary. They take action. They don't care about what the party does. They do. Your party is reactionary. If you make the plot push through your players, it's probably not going to push.
Yeah.
So you let the big bad evil guy be the one that's pushing the plot, or you let your villain at that moment be the one pushing the plot.
Oh yeah, and I will admit, in your Rock Roller campaign, the mech one, and I did some things wrong. I will admit to that. I killed a bunch of NPCs off screen, and I was just all like, just to like prove how evil the guy was. And that was probably not the smartest move because they actually had plans for that, and that was just kind of like the DM just like creating conflict instead of doing a wise decision. But on other time, most of the game, you know, he did nothing. They never had any contact with him. They didn't know anything about him other than a city would go missing. A bunch of people would be reported dead. People would come up and be like, he killed a bunch of people, and they had to take the word on it. You know?
On that, something I wanted to mention was this idea. You said, Rob, that your villain needs to be actionary. And I think that for every game I play, I decide early on what things will be true regardless of what the players do in the world. And I actually got this from a book that's a really great resource that I use fairly often called Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. By Sly
They wrote
Flourish.
a book about me?
And of course, the author is actually Michael Shea, and it's Sly Flourish's Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. You can find it on slyflourish.com. Not a plug, I promise. Just a book that I actually use fairly often. And in there, they talk about developing the 6 truths for your world. So really, when I'm making a setting, and I'm bringing up setting for a reason, I think that I first decide what is absolutely true and unmending in this world, what will not change no matter what the players do. I decide on those before the session 0 even begins. And maybe the world's at war. Maybe goblins are communists. That's actually one of the truths from my current campaign. Well, and not to mention the nihilist merfolk, but we can get into that on another show.
We had Russian bear people.
Ooh, that was a good one. But I wanted to ask. So, Rob, you said you have multiple session 0s, and I remember one of the session 0s for High School DnD where we decided on the setting, and you said, guys, we can go this route with this setting, this setting, this setting. But how early on do you guys think a setting should be decided?
I mean, that's probably number one.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I think your setting and your theme is probably going to go hand in hand. So generally, that's my first talk, my first real session 0 is, what do you guys want to play? Because of course I'm going to have a list of things I want to play. And, you know, I've always heard that whatever game you want to play in, you should probably run. Mm-hmm. So I write out a list of things that I want to run, and I present that to my players, and I'm like, these are the themes I want to play. And generally that will go hand in hand with a setting.
Okay.
So like, I think someone bounced around the idea of doing like a high school anime, and I was playing.
Yes, it was.
And I was playing Persona at the time.
That's why we.
And I was just being introduced to the whole SMT Persona, and I'm a old Final Fantasy guy, so like this blew my mind. I was having a great time, and so he said high school anime. I was like, please let them pick that one. Please let them pick that one. And they went with it. They bit. So
well, we all at first thought, is there really any way we're actually going to do this? And then we realized all of us had the same feeling, like, please, everyone else agree to do this.
I had no idea how I was going to do it, but I mean, it's worked out and it's been so much fun. But so theme and setting is like very first thing I do.
That's really funny because that's almost the exact opposite for me. Because I kind of like I wouldn't, and once again, I play in a group where I know the guys really well. And this would be a different story had we had more new players and whatnot. But I remember before our last Travelers game, I went, okay, they voted on this and they banned it immediately. They voted on this and they banned it immediately. So I came and I said, I want to run this game. Who wants to play? And we had some people that were just like, I don't know if I'll have fun on that game. I know nothing about it. I'm like, just trust me. I will do everything I can to make it fun for you. And I remember specifically one of our players had never seen an anime before and definitely never seen a mech anime. And he was just like, he was super reluctant, and I was like, "You just trust me on this." And he ended up having loads of fun. He would message me about it. He's just like, "I can't believe I hadn't experimented with something like this before." And I was just kind of like, "Well, I know what you guys, with playing in this group for so long, I kind of know where your interests tend to lie." So I decided to build the world based off of what I thought that they would enjoy, and then let them steer it. And I did that also in the D&D game. I was just all like, man, I really want to play a Nier Automata style game, Final Fantasy. So I walked up to them and I said, hey guys, I want to run a futuristic D&D campaign. And I think we did vote on that one. But I was just kind of like, I was like, these are the games I want to run, and I put it up top, and then I put a bunch of spaces, and then the other options, and everyone's just all like, they knew where I was sitting at that point, and I was like, yeah, I mean, the vote's more of a customary at this point because I kind of know what you guys are gonna pick.
Yeah, and I wanted to say something, maybe a little bit of an elephant in the room that listeners might be surprised we haven't mentioned yet, but what about pre-made campaigns? I can say honestly, I have used a pre-made campaign once, and about 20 pages in, abandoned it to do our own material, our homebrewed world building material. Do you guys ever use those as a start? Or maybe when you were a new DM, did you do that? And do you think new DMs should approach those? Rob, what do you think?
Well, I've only played in them.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I've played in them, we've never finished them. And we usually abandon them, just like how you did. However, there is a group of people that do enjoy that. And by all means, if you enjoy that, do it. But I personally am more of a fan of homebrew world building and storytelling through our own means. And I know you can do that to some degree in the supplements, but it's just not for me. And I'll be happy to play in them again, but I don't think I'll ever run a game in a pre-built game.
That's the thing, because the supplements are 100%. They're built for you. They're there. If you like doing that, you're not going to have fun running that game. However, actually, I kind of encourage it for newer players because a lot of times they don't have motivations. They don't know how to play the game quite well yet. So they're like, you're sitting there telling them all this stuff and they're just like, it's going over their head. It's really nice to have a supplement to just be like, okay, this is a little bit about the world, and they can read up all on it, and it gives them a good trial experience. But in my experience, I've also never finished one of those games. However, I did do one. It was kind of like in my dark times when our old group kind of broke apart. I went and joined a group, and I had a lot of fun. It was very different. In our groups we role play like 90% of the time, and it was really fun to just sit there and just be like smashing orcs with hammers and just be like not caring. I'm like, here's my dice, like take it, and not have to worry about talking to people.
Yeah, and I do find that actually the pre-made adventures are fairly combat heavy, and we are definitely a role play heavy party. But I think I think that's the fun of Dungeons and Dragons. I think the number one thing I really enjoy about Dungeons and Dragons is building a world with my friends. I think that you all will agree that by the end of your campaign, you look back and you look at this world you've built together, full of lore and stories, and story arcs and villains you've taken down and achievements you've created and conquered together. And I think there's nothing more satisfying than doing that. And I find that much more satisfying than a pre-built game. But I did want to go back. What did you say, Robert? What do you have?
I'm sorry. I just want to mention that I love bringing this up. This is one of my favorite things to say, but the combat's fun, and I know some people do take combat to be like, hey, this is what the game's about. But I mean, if you look at the cover of the Player's Handbook of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, on the bottom it says a role-playing game.
Absolutely.
But I don't know. I'm a huge fan of combat. I try to ensure that every single game I run has some sort of combat because I know that someone likes it.
Sure.
And also, I like it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think that's one of the things to actually discuss at a session 0. And Rob, you mentioned you have multiple session 0s. At what point does the topic of how much role play versus combat come up, or do you decide that for the players? Or
that's probably at the very beginning, setting expectations. So that goes into so you got settings and themes, and then you set expectations for your very first meeting with them. From there, I'd probably tell the guys or whoever's playing, come up with your characters, come up with backstories. I'm not limiting you, but I do encourage, even if it's not in a sit down setting, message each other, talk about your characters, try to come up with stories together. Don't hesitate to interact with each other, even if you're not in the session together. And then the second time we get together, we all flesh that out together and try and come up with closer bonds and closer ties based on what we came up with.
I actually, I kind of set that in there. I think one of the things I do is I like to tell them, I'm like, you guys have played games with me, or if you haven't played games with me, this is what I like to do. If you're not interested, feel free to sit this game out. But I think a thing that we left out that's kind of huge is you can do role play in combat. And I remember when I first introduced that into the party, it was really weird. It was like, I had to introduce it in the anime style game, the first one we did. And basically the villain on every turn was just yelling paragraphs of dialogue I had written out for them. And eventually they caught on. And then so now in our combat settings, I love it. They're talking to each other. They're doing role play stuff. They're in character in combat. And I'm like, oh, this is so cool. And that's something that you can't, I guess, tell them right off the bat, this is what you want. It's kind of something you have to kind of show them. So I don't know if that's necessarily a session 0 idea for me.
No, that's mostly in combat asking questions for me. So it's like they do something. How do you do it? Are you doing like this? Are you doing like that? And then eventually they'll start catching on. And, I noticed with this group specifically with SIO and High School DnD, these guys do a very good job of, I'm not simply doing an attack. I'm doing it like this. And I'm, I'm saying this, and, it's really great.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also brings into the idea of tabletop expectations. Even on Roll20, we all know there's a sort of unspoken etiquette that we have for these sorts of games. But do you guys discuss party expectations for the table or for even Roll20 in session 0? Tyler, what do you think?
Yes, you have to. You have to do it. We had a player that was not naming names, but probably drinking too much, and it was actually a health concern, and his friends were worried about it, and his friends were worried about it, and we almost had to have a D&D intervention. And it worked, and it was really nice because his friends were like, we're coming from a place of love, but that was something when I ran my very next game, I put in my expectations. I'm like, hey, if we have to kind of talk about your behavior or how you act to other players in the group. You get this many warnings before we find a new member, and that has kept it in check pretty well. And it's hard to say, but you got to do it.
I mean, I don't recommend this for every party, but some parties, this is very necessary. But in one campaign, I wasn't even the DM. It was a first time DM. And I asked the DM, I said, hey, I think we need to establish a set rules of etiquette. And he was on board with it. And I wrote it out for him. I said, do you approve of this? He approved of it. We posted it and we said, look, guys, we got to clean this up because it's taking away from the fun from everybody. And that's what the setting expectations is. That's what establishing the etiquette is. It's ensuring that everyone at the table is having fun.
We had a player that was robbing and attacking other members in the party. Ooh. And then we were like, okay, this is not cool. And then it kept happening. And since the DM wasn't being, I guess, heavy-handed on it, it continued until
assertive,
until it became a very big issue, and to the point where one of the players, just often killed the other player. And that all could have been avoided had someone just been like, the DM at one point said, no, I'm putting my foot down. And unfortunately, it has to happen. And there's a way to do it that is not aggressive and is very, pleasant and all parties can agree to. But if you wait, that you don't get that option anymore.
Absolutely. And that brings up something I wanted to mention. This is actually quite relevant at session 0. We've all had that character show up, or a player show up with a character that's min-maxed to all hell. Somehow they rolled 20 on 3 of their stats.
Why are you looking at me?
Hey, man. We've all had that character show up. And sometimes you have to say, you know what? Let's remake your character. I think because the idea of the min-maxer is something we'll come back to.
That's an episode in itself.
That is, and just to set out there, I don't think the min-maxer is a negative character to have in the party. It can be excellent to have, though the way you gear your game needs to accommodate your players' styles. But I will say that I'm using that as an example because that normally for me is the player I've had to make the most expectations clear for.
Yes,
especially when another issue I had, you mentioned drinking at the table. I've had issues with that where players will go to their turn and take several minutes on their turn when they could have been thinking about what they were going to do in combat for the entire time before. So I think setting up those expectations can be very important.
Oh my gosh. Session. And there's a lot of times where drinking's not involved. They're just a slow player. And I've even flat out said, you are not allowed to pick a spellcaster. And then someone else, I'm not pointing fingers, but someone in this podcast group said, it's okay if he plays a druid.
No, hold on. Let me be specific. It was a Circle of the Moon druid.
Yes.
Which is heavily shapeshifter.
And I will say up until level 15, he did a fantastic job, but now he's starting to read his spells and go, oh, druid spells are cool. And I'm just like, no. You came in as a half barbarian, stay that half barbarian, transform into a bear and just throw away your spell list. And
he's unfortunately a sleepy boy.
And he hasn't even pulled out the spells until I started throwing the enemies that are resistant to spells. And I'm just like, come on, man.
Absolutely something. And that brings me to something else. What happens when you show up to session 0 and all of your planning goes out the window and you have a group of, and I may or may not be speaking from experience recently.
We all are.
A group of 5 or 6 players that want to play the most complicated classes you can possibly imagine. What do you do in that situation? Do you say, no, you're playing the Elf Ranger, unrevised? Short stab at you there, Tyler. But do you say that, or do you say we'll learn this together? Because I had someone show up to a campaign once, and they wanted to play a Tiefling Warlock their very first campaign, and I said, let me tell you what playing a Tiefling Warlock is going to be like for you. And they promptly changed to be playing a Rogue.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful experience. I wish you could talk to my players sometimes, because I ran a Star Wars game, and we pulled out the Star Wars book and we built a bunch of Jedis, and then on session 1 they decided to all become pirates, and I had to basically delete my Star Wars PDF and all my notes and start over. I think it's very important to adapt, and even to write into your planning, if all goes to fail, what should we do? But I think there are measures you can take that will prevent this. And one of them is, and I think this is another video, is having your party's morality cleared up at the beginning, and being a little stern about it. If you're like, okay, guys, and I think my friend Ethan did this great. He said, we're playing a hero campaign. You're all heroes. No one played a villain, and it's like, okay, that makes sense. So I come in, I said, hey, we're playing a hero campaign. And I was very stern about it, but we had this new player that was like, oh, Siths are heroes. And then I'm like, no, you cannot build a Sith. Well, and I sat there the whole time and I was very clear about my expectations. Guy goes home and just writes a new character and takes that one to session 1. That's something you can't plan for. And so I will say, in that campaign, I think I turned it around, but like I had to throw everything away and kind of like go, okay, what do we do from here? And I think what worked was I piggybacked the lore and everything off of a previous game, and it gave me a little more freedom, a little more wiggle room. I was like, I came in expecting to do A, and they did Z, and I said, okay, well, let's just tie Z into this other game, and that way I don't have to do any world building. The world's already built for you guys, and if you want to do world building, well, guess what? You lost your chance when...
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said earlier about building a malleable world. Build something so that no matter what your players come in here with, you can adapt. You can adapt cities, you can adapt regions, evil characters, even major plot lines can be adaptable. For me, I know that I want certain fights to happen at certain points in the story, but maybe your players... maybe you have a story arc waiting that your players happen to get to at a time that makes sense, and you just bring in that story arc then.
And the other thing is don't be afraid. And this is something I always tell myself: don't be afraid if you want to build, the group of heroes and they come in and they're villains, to let your players be villains and have the heroes be the BBEG, that they have to defeat. Because
murder hobo party.
Yeah, because I think the game would have been a lot better, a million times better. And I think they still had fun. But they were definitely playing villains, and I shouldn't have tried to like shoehorn them into the hero spot. I should have just been like, okay, yeah, you guys are doing these sinister, evil things, and now you have these Jedis coming after you, instead of like, okay, these evil guys are coming after you. Why? Because they're more evil. And I didn't plan that out well. That was a big mistake on my end. I think it worked out, but if I was not afraid to just be like, oh, okay, it's a villain campaign, and just roll with the punch like that, I think the game would have been way more smooth and efficient and fun.
Yeah.
That's just a thought.
Yeah, and some of you might be noticing that we keep talking about how decisions made in session 0 will affect the entire campaign. Inevitably, we've all made poor choices at a session 0 that led to some issue to the campaign later on, or led to places we didn't really want the campaign to be. So it's almost inevitable that we're going to talk about later sessions when we're talking about choices we make in session 0. I think I left a big one out. I think I left a really important choice for session 0 out, and that's, what game do you play? And this, I think, is another episode entirely, because we can really delve into a lot of that, because there's a bunch of games to play.
Play Travelers.
What about Vampire the Masquerade? That's one we've been meaning to get to at some point.
I know. And there's actually...
No, it's a bunch.
There's actually a lot of fun games that I've never tried, and there's even some like online simulators you can do as a group that are loads of fun.
Yeah, so maybe that'll be another episode. But I think we're getting to the end of our time here. I just wanted to say, do either of you have anything else you want to mention to our listeners about Session Zero? Anything you didn't get out, or have a closing statement here?
I think ultimately what Session Zero is about is for not as much for you as the DM to go into it with like all this stuff developed, because me personally, I have very little developed by Session Zero, and I develop around my players, but instead get to know the characters that your players have made and build the world around them, because ultimately they are your story. Yeah, you're going to have NPCs. Yeah, like I said, your BBEG or any of your villains are going to be the actionary sources, but they're taking the action because your players exist, right? So that, for me personally, has always been a road to success in my campaigns, is building my campaigns around my players and their characters. And just to touch on real quick, because I know that me and Tyler in some ways have differing philosophies, and it's not in a bad way. It makes for fun whenever I get to play in his campaigns, because it's like I would have never thought to do that. But me personally, if players come into Session Zero and they said they're going to do something, but then they come into Session 1 and it's something totally different, that's probably one of the very few times where I'm okay with saying no.
Yeah.
And I don't say it often, but that's probably one of those times where I'm like, no, you said you're doing this Session 0. You can't switch it for Session 1. And if that's the case and it becomes a big deal, there comes a point where it's like you're the facilitator as the GM or as the DM. And ultimately you have to think about the entire party's best interests. And I recently had to tell a player, I'm sorry, this is the case. And if it's not going to work for you, it's not going to work for us. And they left.
Yeah, and same thing happened in my game. Unfortunately, if they come in my experience, it's a little different. If they come in and I say you have to play this character, well, they're going to find a way to have that character commit suicide like instantly, and that actually happened in one of my games. Like Session 2, character just out of nowhere pulled out a gun, shot himself, and I was like,
"Oh man,
huh." So where do we go from here? That's pretty, and I could have done some shenanigans to like punish him for that, but I was like, you know what? It's not going to be fun for anyone if I keep poking this dead horse. So yeah, it is a little different. But like I said, it's definitely varied on the players. If you know the party, that helps a lot. I do think, I can't stress enough being clear about your expectations, and not being afraid to be occasionally heavy-handed, but I don't like those DMs that are just like, my word is law, I'm the god of this world. But I think it's okay to just be like, okay, we really can't do this, and sit down and explain why. And I also think when you're doing a Session 0, we didn't mention this, but this is something that both Rob and I do, but have a list of questions you want to ask your players. Do you have any rivals? Like generic ones. What's the character look? Just get them thinking, just the things like that. I definitely love, and I think I got this from Rob when they build a rival. And so I made it required in this game. I said, give me a rival. And if they put zero thought into it, well, I'm just not going to use it. But if they actually put some good thought into it, well, bam, that's a pre-built NPC for me.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a pre-built enemy for me. And sometimes, I think the most hilarious rival we have is a guy that's actually their ally, who's just contending. We have a wrestler in our group, and he's just another wrestler, and they just have a rivalry amongst each other because they always fight over the wrestling belt, and they've helped each other. And they also hate each other. And it's just this beautiful intertwining friendship. And I would not have had that had I not sat down and told him, I'm like, everyone build me a rival and let's see where that goes,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's for my closing comments. I just think that those of you that are still afraid of being a DM and being afraid of starting a session 0, there are so many resources out there. And I'm looking right now at this Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master book that I mentioned from slyflourish.com. There's subreddits. I use subreddits all the time, like the our DM Toolkit, or our D&D Behind the Screen. Those are 2 subreddits I use all the time, just to see what other dungeon masters are out there doing for their parties. And on there, you can find questionnaires to give your players for the first games and everything. So there are many, many resources out there available. I have tons of resources.
You're forgetting the most important one, which is our comment section. Right. Our Twitter, our Facebook page. We will answer any questions you have if. And you know what? I think it's worthy. If I would love for you to ask me a question that I have to look up, because that just gives me an excuse to read.
Oh, absolutely. There's so many things to learn about this. I can't imagine considering myself an expert without having read through his player's handbook just a few more times.
A few more times, yeah.
And that's all for today. Thanks so much to Rob and Tyler for joining me. Be sure to check out our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at SIO Tabletop. And of course, our Twitch channel at SIO Tabletop, where you can catch the guys streaming some tabletop gaming. Our Patreon, SIO Gaming. And of course, our YouTube channel, Spell It Out, for the latest episodes of High School DnD. Thanks, everyone. We'll catch you next time on the next episode of My GM Academia.